Well, thank you so much for coming to FGCU towards the end of this event. And so we have the doors open, and hopefully a few more students will be joining us. We have one of our grad students that's been involved in the whole program. And so I think we could probably get started. It's 12:05, so if you'd like to share what's been happening lately, we're all ears, and we're looking forward to hearing your first person perspective, because it sounds like it's been quite an event.
Can you hear us okay?
You sound very clear, Angela. I heard John before.
Okay, great.
And this is just a sound test from Mike. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound very good.
Thank you.
Who would like to start us off today and tell us about what you've been seeing and hearing in COP29 today?
John, Mike, Matthew, do you want to, or Michael,
Angela,
do you
go
want to
ahead
begin?
and kick us off as you normally do, and we'll just treat this as a regular daily briefing.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to our COP29 briefing from Baku, Azerbaijan. Today we have with us John Capiche, Matthew Hill, and Michael Fiedler, and myself, Angela Fobbs. I'm a Florida resident that lives in Germany, but I've been working with these guys for the past couple of years on COP. There's a lot of things going on at COP today and in the past couple of weeks. And we'd definitely like to share those things with you. Let's start with Matthew. What have you been seeing today? What's going on?
Yeah, so today had a lot of cool things and also a lot of not cool things. So it was a mixed bag today at COP as always, but it was still a wonderful experience. And I personally got to meet some really cool people, so I'm really grateful for that. So kind of to kick things off, today as a whole involved lots and lots of talking. So COP29, the official last day is tomorrow, and we're still not really all that close to having a finalized version of any of the proposals for the negotiations or for the funds that have been talked about being established. And so, if you've been keeping up with any sort of UN negotiations in the past, you'll know that they are quite grueling. And so today, I actually got to witness one of those up close and got to personally watch some of the most powerful people in the world spend about 10 minutes debating one sentence of one paragraph and then not come to a conclusion and then move on. And then a couple hours later, that very same document was the subject of a large panel between almost every single country that has a representative. We're all discussing it, and nearly all of them said, you know what, this is really great, but we're not going to approve it. And so that's where we are at for a few very important documents, notably the Loss and Damage Fund, which is a fund that's been set up and quite a bit of money has been pledged to for losses and damages to help countries that have been ravaged by the effects of climate change recover from. A lot of the money has been pledged to that, but a finalized draft has not been put forward as of the second to last day of this conference. So it's a little bit of a concerning spot for us to be in. And the case is the same for the new quantified collective goal, the Article 6 carbon market. There's been talk of countries putting forward a goal of 1 trillion or more every single year, 1 trillion USD. And so that's kind of the goal of these 2 weeks. it doesn't seem like we're all that close. So there's a very high chance that these negotiations will continue several days after the conference officially ends. And I personally am very hopeful that they will continue, so that some sort of solution will be worked out and they're not just put off for another meeting. So the chances are seem low, but not zero for a successful outcome of this COP. Um, and if you are curious as to what exactly these arguments are about in terms of what could be debated about a loss and damage fund, surely people could just say, oh, I'll contribute this much, I'll contribute this much, and then you put it together. No. There was, I think, about 5 minutes spent deciding whether a paragraph should say other multilateral climate funds versus an actual list of multilateral climate funds. There were several minutes of discussion there. There were several minutes of discussion on sealing successful projects versus maximizing impact. Very, very important differences to be made. And this is not a new problem, of course. If you were up with the UN dealings back in 2015, there was a debate over using the word shall versus the word should. And that debate almost derailed the whole Paris Climate Agreement. So if you're a fan of the Netflix show Suits, you might remember from the first season the rules dictate that you must be precise, as the law is a precise endeavor. And this is absolutely true of the UN negotiations. However, in the context of so many calls for climate action now, climate finance now, and hearing about all of the urgent effects of climate change that are happening right now in Florida, we got those hurricanes across the world. There's been so many fires and floods. And so there's very much a warrant for climate action now. And that's not exactly what's happening at these United Nations negotiations. So that's a little bit unfortunate. But on a much more positive note, I did personally see some very uplifting things today. Every day of a COP conference will have a different theme, and today's had several different demographics all lumped together, but one of those was youth. And so there are quite a few youth-focused events that I got to go to. And if you are interested in some light homework, I can absolutely give you some. Um, two documents that two courses and one document that I was personally provided with have been very interesting so far. So if you're interested in learning about the UN climate change process, you can actually just Google a participant guide of the UN climate change process. And that'll take you to an online training course that's only 2 or 3 hours, and it'll educate you on the whole process of UN climate change dealings, which is really, really interesting. It should be free, and it's a great way to learn about all of these processes online. And if you're more into just negotiations overall, you can also Google Mastering International Climate Negotiations, All You Need to Know. Same sort of thing. These both are UN sponsored online courses with a certificate that you get at the end. You can take and learn about the UN process. They're a really great resource, and they're really good for inspiring action beyond these conferences. Um, and just for more learning, and also for a document that you can share with your friends and family. If you Google UNICEF, A Young Person's Guide to Sustainable Energy, it has just a wonderful walkthrough of how renewable energy kind of takes its place in the modern world, what stakeholders exist, lots of different processes, really great for learning and then for sharing with other people who might be interested or might not be super educated on renewable energy. So good and bad things happening at this conference as always. So before I turn it over, I just want to leave a note of there's been 29 climate change conferences. We're on COP29, and we still haven't got a finalized way to solve climate change. And so that should tell us that we can't just rely on the United Nations. We can't just rely on world leaders we're never going to meet to do the work and put in the effort. And so that can be cause for a little bit of dejection. But what it should really do is inspire us to step forward and take action, because climate change is happening now and the effects are happening now, but they are going to continue to happen and they're going to continue to worsen. And they're going to affect our future as college students and young folks. They're going to affect our future so much. We need to be the ones to step up and do something and work on the technology and share it and push for legislation. These are tasks that we can't afford to not do, and there's no space to just sit back and hope that the elected officials will take care of it for us. We've got to take care of ourselves. We've got to step forward and do this. And so, any thread you can find to unravel from the sweater of climate change, work on that, and don't think that there aren't things you can do. We can't afford to not take action. And that's going to close out my briefing.
Well, thank you, Matthew. That climate change, the guide for renewable energy sounds really interesting. Like a lot of people could use that to understand it for sure. I'll have to check that out after the broadcast. Michael, how was your day today at COP?
Thank you for the floor, Angela. My day was busy. It was enjoyable. I really enjoyed my day today. And I have a set of photos which kind of wraps up the last 12 days. I'm not sure I'm allowed to present them or if you would just want a briefing for one day, but I already prepared one for the last 12 days together. And some of the images, I'm proud of them. So if you would allow, I would like to show them, because today I took probably 2 good images, but during the last 10 days, I have probably 10 good images. So I really would like to show them all together, if that would be okay.
Yeah, that would be great. Please go ahead. I think you
Okay,
should
so
be able to share.
let me just share my screen. And here we go. This is the first image, sort of as a summary. So the welcome to COP29. I took one of this image on the very first day, I believe. So welcome to COP29, and let me just walk you through some of the images I've taken recently. The the COP29 took place at the Baku Olympic Stadium. It can host up to 70,000 people. It's a huge stadium, really huge stadium. But I definitely would not say that there were 70,000 people at COP this year. The estimates are something between 20 to 30,000 people. So a huge decrease comparing to the previous COP in Dubai, where there was around 80 to 90,000, no, like 90,000 people. You can see it in some of the meeting rooms, in some of the plenaries. Sometimes they are pretty empty. So this image should show that. On the other hand, some delegations, they come with high numbers. Typically, those are the African nations, and it's usually the minister and his suite and his family and his extended family and extended family of the extended family. Some of the delegations seem to me that they are treating it like a family trip, but that's just my impression. This would be an image from the main plenary hall, and this should give you an idea of the scale of the conference. It can get really huge, and when it gets crowded, it's huge. Sometimes it's not so easy to get into one of the plenaries because there is quite tight security when the ministers and prime ministers and presidents come. Sometimes you just cannot get in, and then it's much easier to watch it on these large screens. Some of the presentations, because they are everywhere in the corridors. But if you get a chance to get in, some of the meetings are open. Then these are the images I took there from the COP29 official photographers spot. So these are the images you typically see in the news. The security is pretty tight, but in this case, this was the Russian TV crew. They were just ignoring the rule that there are no interviews allowed to be filmed in the plenaries. They just ignore it, but the UN security did not step in. When the plenaries, sometimes the plenaries are also used for external meetings on various presentations. It's not all about politics. This was about business or about climate finances. Earlier today, I also took this image when the plenary was actually used for COP29 People's Plenary. So there were mostly the protesters, and they were having sort of a party there. I have never seen the plenary so lively as it was today. And this is the theme of the main theme of the protests. It's the slogan is "Pay Up." So the protesters demand not billions, but they are demanding trillions of dollars every year. And as I went to one of the sessions today, the number which seems to be kind of agreed on or which is being demanded is $1.3 trillion every year for the developing countries. Now, if we go away from the plenaries, we can just have a quick look through the informational booths. There are many of them, and it's interesting to have the small discussions there. There was also a touch of AI, but personally, I was a little disappointed that AI was not so much, wasn't promoted too much at this COP, or at least I did not really see too much of AI there. Or you can end up in one of the press conferences rooms and you get a chance to ask your questions. In this case, there was a press conference by the US of Agriculture, Vilsek, so he was just delivering his speech there, and there was a chance to ask him also some questions. And then there are also the meeting rooms. This was one of the capacity building hubs, and there are discussions going on all the time. And I think this image should actually show that COP is mostly about discussions, because you can see people discussing various issues all the time. Now, most of the action happens in the various pavilions, and the most crowded pavilion at all times was the Chinese one. There are also pavilions which are highly scientific. So this would be the image from the cryosphere pavilion. There are really high level, top level scientists there. And some of the discussions I had there, they were simply kind of over my head. I don't really understand the science that much. And there is, for example, the pavilion from Ukraine, and they had a presentation 2 days ago about the 1,000 days of war in Ukraine. So it was kind of depressing. And if you felt depressed and wanted to feel a little better, you just have to walk 20 meters and you end up in the Russian pavilion, which basically said, relax, it's all good. So you get various feelings there, just walking a few meters here or there. Some of the pavilions are very colorful, and there are some artistic presentations, and it gets noisy, and there is a lot of music and dancing and so on. The Thai pavilion, they always promote, as I have learned, the name of the baby hippos, Mudong, if I'm not mistaken. So if you've been to COP and visited the Thai pavilion, you must have a photo with the baby hippo there. Of course, there is the US Center or the US Pavilion, and I believe John is sitting in that pavilion right now. And some of the politicians showed up there as well. So here would be the Senator Whitehouse and Senator Markey. There are also some other presentations and workshops. I did not really understand some of them. This one was just an artistic presentation, how, in the opinion of the girl in green, how the Caspic Lake looks like. So it's basically water and oil together. If you leave the pavilions, there are often also various demonstrations. Some of them are, they seem large, but it's not a crowd of more than 200 people. Comparing it to 200,000 people in Madrid or Glasgow, these are just tiny protests. Some of them protests are kind of confusing because, for example, this one was against the nuclear energy. And I was just coming to this protest from a discussion from a pavilion which is promoting the nuclear energy, which is basically saying we need to increase our nuclear energy production 3 times. So it can get confusing. It can get also pretty loud. So these indigenous people were making a lot of noise to get some attention. these indigenous people, they just chose a different strategy. They decided to be completely silent. So they just walk around for a few hours with signs like that. The indigenous people, it was actually the main theme of today was the indigenous people. And I got really kind of touched by the protest of this girl. I think she was about 12 years old. And it was really powerful. I mean, I have seen tens or more hundreds of these protests, and this one was really touching one. So I tried to capture it in the photo as well. But there were more shouting today, so this is just an image from the plenary. Yet another loud protest, and this is, and underline some of the protests are not really that much about climate change, that there are about various political issues. But according to the UN rules, you cannot really name which country is standing against each country, which country. So I'm sticking with the UN policy and not naming the countries. Obviously, it's the Middle East region. One more thing I wanted to mention is I was surprised how many young people were at this COP. The girl in the middle, the small girl, the little girl, she's 10 years old. She's from India, and she was the youngest moderator of a COP dialogue or COP session. Very interesting. There were also more kids. These during the past few days, these kids were 10, 11 years old, and they were delivering some presentation, some interviews for local TVs, and it was they were very skilled. I was very surprised how well they did. And one more mention is I just want to mention the volunteers, the local university students who kind of take 2 weeks off. They have some online lessons, but they spend most of the time at COP, and they just stay there for 2 weeks. They work for free, and they help the delegates to move around. So big shout to the Azeri students who are volunteering there. I'm coming to the end of my presentation because time is short, but this is from the negotiations rooms, and it was, as it was already mentioned, it can get really frustrating to sit there. You sit there for an hour, and they just keep talking about one sentence of one paragraph. So what you see on the screen right now, that's worth of about 2 hours of work. And the agreement is, let's meet tomorrow and we'll see if we come to a compromise. I also attended one of the coordination meeting of the LCDs, the least LDCs, least developed countries, and it was so frustrating to sit there for 1 hour. And basically, we learned that there was a ministerial meeting yesterday. We will be briefed about it tomorrow. There is another meeting going on today. We will learn about it the day after tomorrow, and there are more meetings coming today. So stay tuned. We'll provide you more information. It's so frustrating to sit there. It's simply frustrating. So to stay on the positive note, if you want to improve your mood, go to some of the scientific pavilions, because the scientists, when they talk, it makes so much sense. They explain the things, they show it with figures and numbers, and it simply makes sense. So this is an image from the IPCC panel, the international, intergovernmental panel on climate change. So the gentleman in the middle is the IPCC director. It's so refreshing to go to one of the sessions like that. So to wrap up, is it worth it to go to COP? Yes, it is absolutely worth it. I cannot recommend it enough. Are we doomed for a failure? I am afraid we are, but we have to stay. We have to remain to be hopeful. So COP29 is slowly ending. Tomorrow is the last day, and what's the future? The future is Brazil. The COP30 is taking place in Brazil, in the city called Belém. So we have 1 year to prepare for the next COP, which will take place in Belém, Brazil. And this would be the last image of the day. I just took it today. I could not help it. The panel discussion was so boring that I was, feeling like the little kid, but I stood it and I just took this image. And with this being said, I'm turning it back to you.
Wow, those pictures were great. I love your photos. They show a different side of COP than just the the technical bits. And I love that last picture. That was awesome. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
All right, John. How was your day today? I'm sure it was quite busy.
Well, I'm also going to show a few photos of the pavilions I visited, and everyone will gain an even greater appreciation for the quality of Michael's photos by comparing them to mine. But as far as a general impression, everything's wrapping up here today. But these COP gatherings are really like a war conference. You could compare it to something like Yalta, where the allies got together to contemplate their uh, strategies and victories and how they're going to prosecute a war. This is on par with that type of meeting. But given that this is in effect a war level conference, it's my impression that 50% of the participants and speakers are from groups like the Red Cross. They're about the victims. They're about the people suffering from the effects of climate change. Perhaps another 30% of the participants are peace negotiators. They're the ones not really interested in waging the war, but rather negotiating a peace. Unfortunately, the counterpart to that negotiation is physics. And physics doesn't really want to show up for those negotiations. So you've got all these people who are sort of discussing how to bring this to a conclusion and how to, in effect, pretend almost it isn't happening or that solutions are in progress, but they're very unrealistic. 20% of the people are here to solve the problem. They're here to wage the battle. And they're very serious people, very capable people. And it's really unfortunate that they're not the majority, and that's not the primary activities going on at this conference. It's almost as if we need two separate conferences. People that are gathering to maybe discuss people being affected by climate change and people looking to actually solve the problem. And maybe we might be in a position to make greater progress. But as I mentioned, the peace negotiators, they're in effect the diplomats, the national representatives, and they are truly a limiting factor in all of this, even if we had greater emphasis on the problem solvers. And as Michael pointed out, a lot of the folks here, not only are they engaged in secondary discussions as to the victory, winning this climate crisis battle, they're not even qualified to speak on the victims or the other secondary issues. They're just here on a junket. And that's not a good indication of how loss and damage funds might be spent once allocated. But I suppose it's a moot issue because those funds are not really flowing anyway, so they're not currently available to be stolen or wastefully spent. But there's plenty of good projects that are being implemented in support of people drastically affected by climate change, and we need to support those. I'd like to share some slides here. Let's see if I can get them up. So as I mentioned, it's a closeout day. There were closing speeches. People were wrapping up their pavilions. A lot of photos being taken of participants, teams involved in managing each of the pavilions. And there were still some pavilions attempting to transact business and conduct sessions. And one interesting session was in the parliamentary pavilion. And there were a couple of members of parliament from the United Kingdom. And one of the noteworthy things that they were talking about is the fact that in the UK, they've really only made plans for achieving 30% of their national target reductions, only 30%. So it's difficult to achieve a plan, if you have not begun to seriously consider it. And these, nationally determined contributions, reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are themselves falling short of what's needed. Those are largely designed to limit greenhouse global temperature increase to about 1.5 C. And as we've been pointing out before, we've in effect already crossed that threshold. And therefore higher goals are required. So I looked at some of the discussions and presentations in the science pavilions. One category of science is not really science, it's accounting, but it's critically important. Unless you have good accounting methods, good procedures, you're not going to implement the science properly. And a lot of science is properly defining a system and accounting for what's going on inside of that system. So whereas accounting may seem a little tangential to science, it's really critical and integral. So you've got carbon credit systems, and for an effective carbon credit market, you have to have very good carbon accounting. Another thing you have to have for implementing solutions are standards, such that when a certain practice or project type is being developed or proposed or implemented, that it follows certain standards so people can't greenwash it and shortcut it. So the participation of these groups like ISO is very important. The cryosphere, as Michael pointed out, was active today. They have displays on the impacts upon glaciers from 2.3, our current NDCs, as well as 3 to 3.5 C increase, which is our current trajectory globally. They pointed out the impacts upon the glaciers in Tibet, in the Himalayas, as well as the Arctic and Antarctic. There's also a set of pavilions dealing with agriculture and food. And right next to the food pavilion was a natural gas pavilion. In effect, gaslighting the convention. They promote the continued use of natural gas as a quote solution. And I would argue that the only way you can look at natural gas as a solution is if you're in a war and you're looking for the lowest caliber weapon. Do you want to be shot by a 50 caliber or a 25 caliber weapon? And whereas methane leakage might constitute a 50 caliber, the actual use of natural gas is a lower caliber weapon, still highly destructive. Japan is always the star of these conferences from a technical and scientific perspective, whereas all the other pavilions were breaking down and having their little parties. Japan was still fully staffed and fully active with all their technical experts on hand to take people through each of the technologies that they were highlighting in their pavilion. And I took a look at the software called GetFlows, which is a water management and a water simulation software package, which is very important for agriculture and water management, both of which are closely tied to the climate crisis. But they had a very sophisticated system, and two specialists there to describe the system to me. And it was a fully integrated software package addressing some of the issues that had been limiting back to the 80s when I was doing these sort of models. So they took a highly sophisticated approach to computer modeling, which gives planners a very good tool for evaluating alternatives. But as I pointed out to them, they can have all the great models in the world, but if we don't have good policymakers and politicians ready to implement the recommendations developed by tools like these, they will never achieve their potential to contribute to the solutions. And as, again, Michael pointed out, the nuclear commitment to triple the global production of nuclear energy is somewhat problematic in my eyes because of the type of technology that's currently ready to be scaled up rather than the technology that might be ready to be scaled up 10 to 15 years from now. But they highlighted the relatively low carbon footprint of nuclear energy, very similar to solar and wind, and then hydro as well. And then they took a look at the carbon sequestration projects as well. Some of this material over here on the left, the biofuels with carbon capture and sequestration, that may be playing a little fast and loose with the accounting methods. But they were pointing out how nuclear needs to represent, or currently represents, 23% of renewable portfolio. But they're also describing here 36% in hydropower. And there's a big debate on to what extent hydropower is renewable or carbon neutral, given the sediment dynamics and release of methane from the bottom of hydropower reservoirs. Ukraine's exhibit pavilion had an interesting display where visitors to the pavilion added their comments. I noticed one here, you can't read it, but it was talking about agriculture and how to improve agriculture as part of the climate solutions. But what really caught my attention in that pavilion was this solar panel. Apparently it was taken from a damaged structure. It's riddled with shrapnel holes and beaten up from either the demolition or being flung through the air after an explosion. But this is in effect points out how we have a limited time window within which we can solve these problems before the destruction starts to take over and undo our best efforts at addressing this climate crisis. So I found that display particularly moving. Another interesting display was in the Malaysia exhibit, the Malaysia pavilion. They had a timeline of their nation's participation in the UN climate process, beginning back in '92 with the Rio Earth Summit, and then in 2002 with the Kyoto Protocol's adoption. And soon after, in about 2010, they adopted a goal to reduce by 40% their greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, by 40%. Then you fast forward over here to 2021, and they're talking about 45% by 2050. So, decades go by, progress is not made, and expectations are effectively lowered as far as at least timelines go. So we've been moving in this process for decades now, and it's even the documentation shows very little evidence of progress. But we stick to it, and we stay at it. And Michael took a nice photo of our group there at the end, and another at the exit. And of course, as he pointed out, we'll be doing this again next year in Rio. So, Angela?
Wow, that's really awesome. I have a question for you, John, before we go on. It seems like right now the problem is not that we don't have viable solutions to tackle climate change, but that our problems are more political than scientific. Is that accurate, or?
Well, I would say that the political problems are simply a reflection of the culture and human nature. Human nature, it drives what we want. It therefore drives who we vote for. And the politicians want to stay in office, so they cater to those desires, at least in our nations. In other nations where voting isn't an issue, they sort of shortcut it from the consumer desires of a large population to the extreme consumer desires of an elite, autocratic subset of the population. So either way you look at it, it's the people in combination with the leadership that have a different set of priorities, which are very short term and very consumer oriented. And that's really the fundamental issue.
Okay. One more question. I hate to just keep asking you questions, but I want to feel hopeful, but it's hard. Do you think that in countries where they're having more active, visible climate change effects, that people there are more willing to do more than in countries where, like a large country like the United States, where if I live in Minnesota, what happens in Florida or California doesn't really, or North Carolina doesn't really affect me?
Well, it's almost the opposite, and Florida is a good example. We've not made any progress in people voting on the climate issue, despite having been hit by repeated climate enhanced hurricanes. Instead, the focus is redirected towards recovery support, money, and everyone gets preoccupied with insurance and government. What are you going to do to help me rebuild my home? So I see huge amounts of money going from the federal government into some of these coastal communities, not to relocate people who are in vulnerable locations, but to spend $500,000 on their home to lift them up a few feet so that they'll be dry during the next hurricane, as long as that hurricane is of comparable magnitude to the one we just experienced. And we know that's not going to be the case. We know they're going to get continually worse. And very often, as was pointed out by Hal Wanless, a climate expert, chairman of the Department of Geology at University of Miami, the multi-billion-dollar projects on Miami Beach to address their stormwater issues affected by climate change. At the current pace of sea level rise, those infrastructure improvements will be made obsolete before the bonds are paid off that were used to make those modifications to their system. So even when we attempt to mitigate some of these things, we're doing it in a fashion that really doesn't make sense over the long term.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for answering my questions. Are we taking questions from the room? Is that all right. Yes, if you would like to ask some questions, please go ahead.
All right, thanks very much. So I've got the microphone. If anybody had any questions for the group? Yes.
I just wanted
It's a little difficult to hear.
Yeah, you can press.
Doesn't sound like the mic's working.
Okay. Is it working now?
Yes.
Maybe you could repeat.
Can you hear me correctly?
Very
Yes.
Okay, were you guys in Brazil? Well, like, I saw something that said VRASIL, or what it was. Oh, that's okay.
What you might have seen is the Brazil Pavilion. So how COP29 is structured, there's a couple different areas. And where we've spent a lot of time in the blue zone is where all of these pavilions are, which are these some pretty simple to some pretty elaborate displays from a bunch of different organizations and entities. So a lot of countries have pavilions. The US, Azerbaijan has its own, and a lot of like NGOs and such have pavilions as well. And so the country of Brazil, BRASIL, I think is how they spelled it on their sign. had quite an elaborate pavilion talking about the road to COP30. So right now, John, Michael, and I, we're in Baku, Azerbaijan, but we visited the Brazil pavilion here at COP29 because COP30 is going to be hosted in Brazil. So the country at their pavilion here had a lot of stuff going on, talking about how things are going to look transitioning over to the next conference and stuff like that.
Are there other questions in the audience? Can you hear me?
Just barely.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question. I was wondering what good came out of this? Because I know one of you said that only about 20% of the people there are actually people who can make a difference and are actually dedicated to it. And I know it sounds a little hopeless that nothing can really come from it. So I was wondering if there's anything good that you realize is coming from this.
Could somebody repeat that question again? It was a little bit fuzzy at the end.
Yeah, she was asking, did anything good come out of this? Because it sounds like everybody's trying to be hopeful, but we were just wondering if there was some tangible success or some tangible results from COP29.
That's a good question. I'm not sure they came into this with high ambitions. Everything I've been hearing is that a lot of the discussions are centered around loss and damage, again, compensating victims. And if they conclude the conference tomorrow and their negotiations, that'll be a sign that not much has been accomplished because it wasn't very difficult. Almost always when they're dealing with tough questions, the negotiations extend beyond the end of the conference, at least a day, at least another full day. So if this actually concludes tomorrow, it'll be a confirmation that they really were not having high ambitions for the outcomes of agreements from COP29. At least that's my perspective. Matthew, Michael?
Yeah, just to kind of jump on that a little bit, it is important to note we're not, like John was saying, we're not going to know from a policy standpoint until at least tomorrow, probably later. Negotiations are still going on. I'm sure there's officials, schmoozing with each other right now, but there's another day of negotiations ahead of us, and like John was just saying, there's likely going to be several more days of negotiations to actually get to like you said, some concrete plans for the loss and damage fund, which is not exactly a solution, but still a step forward, for the carbon market, which not exactly a solution, but still a step forward, for $1.3 trillion. That'd be pretty cool. It's on the table. So we're not going to know until at least a couple more days, at least from that like United Nations Charter standpoint. But I will say something that's very important to remember is that well, John gave a breakdown just now of all of the different people that are here, and quite a large number of the people that are here are scientists and people in the field. This is a huge gathering of almost everyone worldwide who's just in the climate field, and so a lot of good that you don't necessarily hear about as much because it doesn't make the headlines is this scientific discourse that's going on both through the panels and just in the in-between spaces when these people, just brilliantly smart scientists and activists, can get together and meet people from all the way across the world. And just today, this is a pretty small example, but it's just something that I happened to see. I met a student from a university in Ohio who works with his school's sustainability office that has some excess funding, and they're just looking for things to use it for, which is not a very familiar, situation to be in. But it was a student who had access to people who had access to excess funds, and he started up a conversation with someone in a solar energy company, and they were working out a plan of how they could actually bring some more solar to that university. And so this is a very small example of just, one school that's going to become a little bit more sustainable. But so many things like that happen when countless people come together and they're all concerned about the climate. So a lot of research has been shared, a lot of connections have been formed between scientists. Um, and there's a lot of value that comes from there. It's not quite as concrete. It's a little bit more difficult to measure. It's not, something you can read a New York Times article about. But that's where an immense amount of value comes from at these conferences.
And if I may just add one more sentence or three more sentences, because today I went to one of the plenaries where the negotiators gathered, and Azerbaijan had the floor, and they basically submitted some draft text for the countries to accept. And I just wrote few notes as I was there, so let me please cite. We will not accept such text. We would like to express our frustration. With less than 36 hours to go, we cannot achieve an agreement. Or this is not negotiable. It must stay in the text. Those are just few examples of the various nations were saying, and this was just 5 different nations, and altogether it's about 200 nations. So this should give you an idea that if these 5 nations couldn't agree on a single thing, there is a very little hope that there will be something agreed on by 200 nations.
I'd like to add something. Matthew was talking about students and their involvement. The USF, I know, has a green fund that the students administer for making changes in energy conservation and other practices at their campus. And I'm curious if FGCU has a similar fund derived from student activities fees or other sources that they themselves administer for improvements on their campuses relative to sustainability. Not that FGCU isn't already, designed to be a highly sustainable institution.
Hey, John, can you hear me all right? It's Lynn.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, the answer is no. And although we pushed for it, we've gotten that kind of bureaucratic response that it's very difficult to shift monies from the foundation to state monies. And our efforts to say it's being done at multiple institutions in Florida haven't quite resonated yet. So we pushed it. We do have a lot of internal efforts, where we have individual departments that are trying to push towards better, but at the university-wide scale, where we can pump money into a green revolving fund, we haven't been able to break the bureaucracy of that. Wish I had a better ending. I thought you had a really good ending, that would come close to the time. I want people to walk out of here with a sense of hope.
Well, that goal might be something that could be reinvigorated as a result of this event.
We could.
So that takes us pretty close to 1. Is there any closing question for the group? Oh, we have one from our grad student. Hold on. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I was looking through some of these over the past week or past 2 weeks. And one thing that stuck out to me about this 1.3 trillion is, do you think it's kind of back pay for the 2009 financial pledge that 43 countries are going to pledge $100 billion a year for climate change for developing countries, and then nobody did that?
Sorry, what was the question?
Do you think that the 1.3 trillion is trying to make up for that pledge in 2009 that countries did not actually fulfill?
I think the hundreds of billions of dollars a year is easily attainable from a corporate perspective. That's just a relatively minor cost of doing business for them. They're making so much money off of fossil fuels. They can easily afford it. You really have to get to numbers that they can't afford before you're really having an effect. Keep in mind, as I pointed out in last week's gathering that if the United States were spending what we'd spent on World War II each year, we'd be spending at least $7 trillion a year, just the United States.
That's incredible, if you're framing it that way. Well, that brings us about to time. Thank you so much. I don't know if anybody had any closing comments, but I'm really grateful that you were able to join us last week and again this week and give us access to so many amazing resources and your daily reports online. So thank you so much. We all wish you had better news to give, but I'm glad to hear that people are engaged, they're exchanging science and data, and hopefully there will be some progress. So again, thank you so much, and we really appreciate this.
One thing I'd like to leave the students with is the mantra we always emphasize that we saw at a protest in Europe: study hard, protest harder.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. And I guess we'll see you for COP30.
Thanks so much.